There is a moment I watch happen to smart, capable, high performing people over and over again, and almost none of them can name while it's happening. It doesn't look like failure. It looks like the opposite. They're working harder, learning faster, saying yes to everything, staying visible, staying busy, staying ahead of whatever new tool or reorg or initiative just landed on their desk. And underneath all of that motion, something quieter is happening. They're starting to wonder if the version of them that used to be enough still is. That question doesn't show up in a performance review. Nobody puts it on a slide, but it is, without exaggeration, the single most common thing I hear in coaching rooms with executives, founders, and senior leaders across every industry I work in. Today, I want to name that pattern out loud, give you the language for it, and hand you a framework I use with real leaders to work through it. Because once you see this trap, you cannot unsee it. And once you can't unsee it, you can finally do something about it. Let's get into it today. Welcome back to Holding the Room. If you're new here, welcome. This show exists because I live in two worlds that rarely get connected. By day, I lead business intelligence for a media organization in New York. I'm inside boardrooms, strategy sessions, AI pilots, organizational redesigns, and transformation initiatives that affect thousands of people. I don't study leadership from the outside. I actually live it. Outside of corporate, I coach executives, founders, and senior leaders who are navigating some of the biggest transitions of their careers. Different industries, different titles, different companies. But the fascinating part, the patterns are almost always the same. Whether I'm coaching a healthcare executive, a technology leader, someone in media, or a founder trying to scale a business, I keep watching the same invisible problem derail good people. Not because they can't learn, not because they resist technology, because somewhere during the transition, they stop recognizing themselves. Leadership measures adoption. Employees measure identity. They are rarely the same scorecard. I remember the exact meeting where this became undeniable to me. We just rolled out a major AI-powered tool across a division of hundreds of people. The adoption metrics were strong. With the first month, leadership was thrilled. And then I sat down on a listening session with a group of mid-level managers, the people actually responsible for making the tool work day to day. And the conversation had almost nothing to do with the software. One manager, someone who had been excellent at her job for over a decade, quietly said, "I used to be the person in the room who knew how to do this. Now, with just a click of a button, the system tells me." She wasn't complaining about the tool. She was mourning a version of her professional identity that the rollout plan never accounted for. That sentence has stayed with me ever since because it's a sentence underneath almost every transformation I've been a part of since. Before we go further, if this is your first time in the Leadership Laboratory, hit subscribe now. Every week, I break down a pattern I'm seeing in real leaders navigating real change, and I hand you a framework you can use immediately. Not theory, not buzzwords, tools you can put to work by your next meeting. Today's episode is about closing the gap between what leadership measures and what people actually feel. We're going to talk about why identity, not technology, determines whether transformation lasts. I'll share observations from my coaching practice, lessons from corporate life, and a framework I use repeatedly with leaders navigating uncertainty. Let's step inside the Leadership Laboratory. Every week, I hear some version of the same sentence. Our company is changing again. Sometimes it's AI, sometimes it's a reorg, sometimes it's a new executive team. Sometimes it's another operating model, another platform, another 5-year plan built within a single quarter. Different language, same emotion. What I've realized after more than 20 years is that the hardest part of change isn't learning something new. Most high performers are excellent learners. Give them a new tool, a new system, a new process, and they'll figure it out faster than almost anyone in the room. The hard part is something else entirely. It's deciding whether the version of yourself that made you successful still belongs in the future you're walking toward. That's not a skills question. That's not a training problem you can fix with a workshop. That's an identity question. And identity questions don't show up on the roadmap. They show up at 11 at night when you're staring at the ceiling, wondering if you're still the person your team thinks that you are. Here's the trap you can't see. I want to name something specific because I think it's the reason so many capable people quietly stall out right when it looks from the outside like they're succeeding. It's called the self-imposed ceiling. Nobody hands it to you. No manager writes it in your review. No org chart draws a line above your name. You build it yourself, brick by brick, usually out of the exact same traits that got you promoted in the first place. Here's how it happens. You get good at something early in your career, and that thing becomes your identity. Maybe it's being the person who's always had the answer. Maybe it's being the one who never drops the ball, who can be handed anything and get it done. Maybe it's being indispensable. Whatever it is, it works. It gets you noticed. It gets you promoted. And somewhere along the way, the trait stops being a strength and becomes a container you live inside. The ceiling isn't the market. It isn't your industry. It isn't even your company. It's the story you've been telling yourself about who you're allowed to become based on who you've already proven yourself to be. And here's the part that makes it so dangerous. It doesn't feel like a ceiling. It feels like your identity. It feels like this is just who I am, which means most people defend it instead of questioning it. There's a companion trap I see just as often, and it usually shows up in the people who are working the hardest. I call that the treadmill of execution. This is a leader who is constantly in motion, constantly checking things off, constantly available, constantly responsive, constantly proving their value through output. From a distance, it looks like drive. Up close, it's often something else. It's someone who has quietly decided that if they ever stop producing, someone will notice they're replaceable. The treadmill feels like progress because it burns energy and generates visible results. But a treadmill, by design, never actually moves you anywhere. You can run on it for years and stay in the exact same place because the running itself has become the identity. Stopping to ask, is this still the right direction? Feels more threatening than just running faster. I've coached senior, accomplished, respected people who were sprinting on that treadmill so hard they hadn't asked a strategic question about their own career in years, not because they were lazy, because they were terrified of what they'd find if they slowed down long enough to look. Both of these traps, the self-imposed ceiling and the treadmill of execution, come from the same root. They are what happens when your sense of self gets fused to a specific set of behaviors instead of anchored to principles. Behaviors have to change as the world changes. Principles don't. And if you don't know the difference, every change in the world feels like you're on an attack of who you are. And that's what I want to work through with you all today. Let's talk about this week's laboratory observation. I've become convinced that people aren't suffering from AI fatigue. They're suffering from identity fatigue. Every month asks them to become a different employee. Every quarter changes the definition of success. And eventually people stop asking, how do I use this? They quietly begin asking, do I still matter? That question rarely gets said out loud in a meeting. It gets said in the hallway, in a one-on-one, in a coaching session at 9 at night when the guard finally comes down. But it is there underneath almost every resistance to change conversation I've ever sat in on. What looks like resistance to a new tool is almost always fear about an old identity. That's where leadership begins, not with the rollout plan, not with the change management deck, with the question of whether the people you're leading still believe they belong in the future you're describing. The first coaching story I want to share with you from this week is a senior executive recently admitted they felt like they were falling behind. They blamed AI. For weeks, every conversation we had circled back to the same complaint. The tools were moving too fast. The younger analysts on the team seemed to pick up new platforms overnight. This person, someone with 2 decades of hard-won experience, felt like they were suddenly starting over. And after listening for a while, I realized the technology wasn't the issue. For years, this person had built a career on being the one with the answers. In every meeting, in every crisis, every strategic pilot, they were the person the room turned to. That had become inseparable from their sense of worth. Being the answer person wasn't just what they did, it was who they believed themselves to be. Now, answers were everywhere. A junior analyst with the right prompt could produce in 10 minutes what used to take this executive a full day of expertise to generate. And if being the answer person was your entire identity, watching answers become a commodity feels less like a workflow shift and more like an eraser. The work became helping them redefine expertise. Expertise isn't possessing every answer anymore. It's exercising judgment, context, and discernment. We spent time separating what this executive actually did well, reading a room, knowing which numbers mattered and which were noise, sensing when a strategy was about to break before the data confirmed it, from the narrower habit of simply having information other people didn't have yet. The information had been commoditized. The judgment never was. Once that identity shifted, curiosity replaced fear. This person started asking better questions instead of racing to produce faster answers. And something interesting happened. The team started bringing them harder problems, not easier ones, because the value they offered had actually gotten more distinctive, not less. From answers to questions. This is the new executive advantage. That story points to something bigger than one executive's confidence problem. I think it's the single biggest shift happening in leadership right now, and almost nobody is naming it clearly. For most of the history of modern work, leadership advantage came from information asymmetry. You knew something your team didn't. You'd been in the industry longer, seen more changes, made more mistakes, and that accumulated knowledge is what earned you the corner office. The whole model of authority was built on being the person with the answer. That model is breaking fast, and not because leaders got worse. It's because answers stopped becoming scarce. When information is one prompt away for everyone in the organization, being the person who knows things stop being a durable advantage. It's still useful. It's no longer rare. And anything that stops being rare stops being the thing that sets you apart. So, what replaces it? The leaders I watch thriving right now, the ones who aren't threatened by how fast the tools are moving, have made a quiet but total shift in how they operate. They stopped competing to have the best answer in the room. They started competing to ask the best question in the room. That sounds like a small distinction, but it's not. Asking a sharp question requires something a fast answer never does. It requires you to sit with ambiguity long enough to know what actually matters before you rush to resolve it. It requires you understand the second and third order consequences of a decision, not just the first. It requires enough contextual judgment to know which question out of 100 possible questions will actually move the room forward. You cannot prompt your way into that. That is earned. This is what real seniority looks like now. I call this the executive advantage, and I think it's the skill that will separate leaders who get replaced by their own tools from leaders who get more valuable because of them. The answer givers are becoming a commodity. The question askers, the ones who can walk into a room full of noise and ask the one thing nobody else thought to ask, are becoming irreplaceable. If you take one thing from this episode and use it tomorrow, let it be this. In your next meeting, resist the urge to be the fastest person to a conclusion. Ask the question instead that slows down the room, and watch what happens to how people see you. I want to examine what I call the velocity paradox. Technology now moves faster than people can psychologically process. Organizations celebrate speed. People crave stability. That gap is where most transformation efforts quietly die. Leadership announces a new capability, a new system, a new way of working, and measures success by adoption rates and rollout timelines. Meanwhile, the humans inside that system are trying to answer a completely different question. Does this change what I'm worth here? Busy is not the same as grounded. Motion is not the same as progress. I see this constantly in organizations that pride themselves on moving fast. Everyone is in motion. Meetings are full, messages are loud, initiatives are launching every week. And underneath all of it, engagement scores are dropping, and your best people are quietly updating their resumes, not because they can't keep up the pace, but because nobody has told them who they're allowed to be inside that pace. I've noticed something across every fast-moving organization I've worked inside or coached leaders through. The teams that hold up under velocity aren't the ones with the least change. They're the ones whose leader kept saying some version of the same sentence throughout. Here's what's changing, and here's what isn't. That second half of the sentence, here is what isn't changing, is the part almost everyone forgets to say. It's also the only part that actually calms a nervous system down. Speed without identity isn't momentum. It's just noise moving faster. There are 3 assumptions I hear leadership teams make over and over again, and every one of them is wrong. The first lie: people don't hate change. They hate uncertainty. Give a team a hard, honest, clear, explained change, and most will rise to it. Give them a vague one, a change that arrives without context, without a clear why, without a sense of where they'll land when it's over, and watch the anxiety spread through the org chart in a single afternoon. It was never the change itself. It was not knowing. I watched 2 divisions inside the same company go through nearly identical restructures within a year of each other. One leader overcommunicated, almost to the point of redundancy, exactly what was changing, what wasn't, and why. The other assumed people would figure it out as it unfolded. The first team came out more engaged than before. The second lost 3 of its strongest performers within a quarter. Same change, different outcome. The variable wasn't the plan, it was the clarity. The second lie: people don't buy strategy first. They buy identity. You can have the most brilliant 3-year plan in the industry, and if the people executing it don't see themselves inside it, it will die in the implementation phase. I've watched flawless decks fail for exactly this reason. Nobody in the room could answer the question, who am I in this new plan? And when people can't answer that question, they don't resist loudly. They just quietly stop showing up for it. The third lie: culture never figures itself out. Culture is not a self-healing system. It is either reinforced or quietly replaced every single day by whatever behavior leadership actually rewards, regardless of what the value posters says on the wall. Say nothing about identity during a major transition, and the vacuum doesn't stay empty. Rumors fill it. Fear fills it. The most anxious voice in the room fills it. If you don't define who your people are becoming, someone or something else will do it for you, and you usually won't like the results. And there is a cost of getting this wrong. Let's talk about what happens when none of this gets addressed, because I don't think leaders always connect the dots between identity fatigue and the outcomes they're already tracking on a dashboard somewhere. It doesn't show up as a single dramatic resignation. It shows up quieter than that. A high performer who used to raise their hand for the hard project stops raising their hand. A leader who used to challenge a bad decision in the room starts going along with it instead. Someone who used to stay late because they cared starts leaving at 5 because caring stopped feeling worth it. None of that gets captured in a turnover report until months later when the person finally leaves, and by then, the organization tells itself a story about compensation or culture fit or the market being competitive right now. Rarely does anyone go back and ask the real question: at what point did this person stop believing they still belonged here? I've sat in enough exit interviews, formal and informal, to tell you the real reason rarely makes it into the paperwork. People don't usually leave because the work changed. They leave because they stopped being able to see themselves inside the work. This is the business case for everything we're talking about today. Identity isn't a soft topic you address after the real strategy work is done. It is the real strategy work. Get it right, and you keep your best people through the hardest transitions. Get it wrong, and you'll be recruiting to replace people you never needed to lose in the first place. I want to examine the identity anchoring framework of my work. This is the part of the episode I get asked to repeat the most. So I want to slow down and actually walk through it properly, because a framework you can't apply isn't really worth much. I call it the identity anchoring framework, and it has 4 stages: archive, anchor, adapt, and accelerate. Archive: remember what built trust. Before you can decide what to keep and what to release, you have to actually know what got you here. Not the vague version, the specific version. What did people trust you for before all of this change started? What behaviors, what habits, what track record earned you credibility you're standing on right now, today? Most leaders skip this step because it feels like looking backward when everyone's telling them to look forward. But you cannot anchor an identity you haven't first taken the time to name. Anchor: separate principles from practices. This is the single most important move in the entire framework, and it's the one almost nobody does on their own. A principle is a belief. A practice is a behavior built to express that belief inside a specific set of conditions. The problem is that most people never separate the two. So when the conditions change and the old practice stops working, it feels like the principle failed, or worse, like they failed. Take that first executive from earlier. Her practice was being the person with the fastest answer. Her principle underneath that practice was something like, I earn trust by being reliably valuable in a crisis. The practice had to change. The principle didn't have to move an inch. Once she could see the difference, she wasn't losing her identity to AI. She was translating it. Ask yourself that question about your own career right now. What is the principle, and what is just the practice you've built to express it 5 years ago? They are probably not the same thing, and confusing them is exactly what makes change feel like erasure instead of evolution. Adapt. Modernize without drifting from your identity. Once you know your principles, adaptation stops being terrifying. It becomes a design problem instead of an identity crisis. You're not asking, do I have to become a different person? You're asking, what is the new practice that expresses the same principle in this new environment? And that's a completely different question, and it's one you can actually answer with confidence instead of dread. Accelerate. Let technology amplify your strengths instead of replacing them. This is the payoff stage, and it's the one leaders rarely get to because they're stuck fighting through their stage 3. Once you've anchored to a principle instead of practice, the new tools stop feeling like a threat to who you are. They become instruments. The same technology that felt like it was erasing your value becomes the thing that lets you express that value faster, at greater scale, with less friction. Acceleration is only safe once you know exactly what you're accelerating. Archive what built trust. Anchor to principle. Adapt the practice. Accelerate with the tools. Now that order matters. Skip a step and the whole thing will collapse. Another leader couldn't understand why delegation never worked. He read books. He understood theory. He knew intellectually that a good leader builds other leaders instead of doing everything themselves. And yet every time he tried to hand something off meaningful, he found himself pulled back within days, rewriting the deliverable, jumping into the thread, just clarifying in ways that quietly took the project back. Eventually, we uncovered the real issue. Being indispensable had become part of their identity. Somewhere early in his career, being the one who could be counted on for anything, the one who never let something fail, had become the entire foundation of his professional self-worth. Delegation wasn't just a management technique to him. It was a threat to the story he told himself about why he mattered. The organization didn't need a better workflow. The leader needed a better definition of leadership. We worked through what leadership actually meant to him, separate from being needed. It was uncomfortable. There's a real grief in realizing that a trait you were proud of, your reliability, your willingness to catch every ball, has quietly become the thing holding your team back. But once he could name it, he could choose differently. Leadership isn't rescuing. Leadership is creating more leaders. Within a few months, 2 people on his team who had been coasting were suddenly making decisions he used to make himself. Not because he trained them differently, but because he'd finally stopped needing to be the one who caught everything. And that gave them room to be what they could be, to grow. Hey, just a quick ask. If this episode is landing for you, this is exactly the kind of pattern I break down every week inside the Leadership Laboratory. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if there's a moment so far that's hit close to home, drop it in the comments. I read every one, and honestly, some of the best coaching stories I share on this show started as a comment. Some of the most revealing moments of my career never happened during the town hall. They happened in the hallway afterwards. That's where people whispered questions that didn't feel publicly safe. Not about software, but about belonging. I've stood in that hallway more times than I can count, on both sides of it, as the person being asked and as the person quietly wondering the same thing myself. Is there still a place for someone like me here? It's rarely phrased directly like that. It usually comes out as a question about a tool or a process or a reorg. But if you listen underneath it, it's almost always the same question about belonging. Whenever leaders clearly connected the future to the organization's identity, people leaned in. They asked better questions. They volunteered for pilot programs instead of quietly waiting to see how things shook out. Whenever identity was left undefined, rumors filled the vacuum. And the best people, the ones with the most options, were usually the first to start looking elsewhere. If you're leading a team through a change right now, that hallway conversation is happening, whether you're in it or not. The only choice you actually have is whether you're the one who's shaping it. I coached someone preparing for a significant promotion. Technically, they were ready. Leadership already knew they were capable. But what held them back was how they saw themselves. Every update sounded like permission seeking instead of executive thinking. In meetings, she'd present a fully formed recommendation and then almost reflectively softened it into a question. Does that make sense? Let me know if you think I should go in another direction. The content was sharp. The framing gave everyone in the room permission to overrule her, including people with less context than she had. We spent our sessions working on something that had nothing to do with her competence and everything that had to do with her identity. She had been rewarded early in her career for being agreeable, for checking in, for making sure everyone felt consulted. And that had served her well as an individual contributor. But as a senior leader, being considered for an executive seat, that same behavior read as uncertainty. Once they embraced the identity of a strategic leader, everything else followed. She stopped asking if her recommendations made sense and started stating them, then inviting genuine debate rather than approval. The shift in language was subtle. The shift in how the room responded was not. The promotion wasn't the beginning of her transformation. It was the confirmation of it. A founder came to me at a strange moment in her business. Revenue was growing. The team had tripled in a year. By every external measure, things were going well. And she told me, almost embarrassed to say it out loud, that she didn't feel like a CEO. She felt like an imposter running someone else's company. We dug into it, and the pattern was familiar. In the earliest days, her identity as a founder had been built entirely on being scrappy, on doing everything herself, on being the one who could solve any problem in the building because she'd built the building herself. That identity had been essential. It was also, at this stage of the company, actively getting in her way. Every time a new director joined and started making decisions without her, some part of her read it as a loss instead of a win. Growth was happening exactly the way it was supposed to, and it felt like, emotionally, she was disappearing from her own company. We spent time separating the founder identity that got her here from the CEO identity the next stage actually required. Being scrappy had to evolve into setting a clear vision others could execute without her. Being the one with all the answers had to evolve into being the one who asked the questions that kept the company honest. Once she made peace with that shift, something she had been quietly dreading, delegation, started to feel like loss, less like loss and more like winning, which was what it was always supposed to look like. I want to come back to something I named earlier because I think it deserves one more pass before we get to the close. The treadmill of execution is seductive precisely because it produces evidence. You can point to it. Look how much I shipped this quarter. Look how much my calendar is full. Look how needed I am. In a culture that measures visible output, the treadmill feels like proof of value. But I want you to notice something about every single coaching story I've shared with you today. Not one of those breakthroughs happened because someone worked harder or executed faster. Every one of them happened the moment someone got off the treadmill long enough to ask a different question about who they were becoming. The executive who redefined expertise didn't out-execute AI. She got curious about judgment instead. The leader who couldn't delegate didn't fix it by managing his calendar better. He redefined what leadership meant to him. The leader preparing for the promotion didn't get the seat by doing more work. She got it by changing the identity she brought into the room. The founder who felt like an imposter in her own company didn't fix it by working longer hours. Instead, she let go of the identity that built the company so a new one could run it. Now listen, execution matters. I'm not telling you to stop producing results. I'm telling you that execution without identity is just a faster treadmill, and a faster treadmill still isn't going anywhere. The leaders who actually break through are the ones willing to stop running long enough to ask where the treadmill is even facing. And this bleeds into my opportunity flywheel. Identity strengthens every stage of opportunity. It shapes strategy. When you know who you are and what you stand for, strategic choices get easier. You stop chasing every shiny initiative and start choosing the ones that actually fit the person and the organization you're building. It creates visibility. People remember leaders who stand for something specific far more than they remember the leaders who simply executed well. Visibility isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about being the most recognizably yourself. It deepens relationships. Trust is built on predictability of character, not predictability of behavior. People don't need you to do the same thing every time. They need to know that whatever you do, it will be consistent with who you've shown them you are, and that improves execution. This is the part people miss. A team that trusts their leader's identity moves faster, not slower, because they're not spending energy trying to guess which version of that leader is going to show up today. It sustains results. Motivation built on fear of falling behind burns out. Motivation built on a clear sense of identity compounds quarter after quarter because it isn't dependent on the next win to keep it functioning. The flywheel doesn't begin with tactics. It begins with believing you belong in the room. Every leader I've watched build sustainable momentum, real momentum, not the sugar high version, started in the exact same place, not with a better 5-year plan, with the decision that they belonged in the conversation they were already in. And now, my favorite segment of the show, the 5 to focus on. If you take nothing else from this episode, I want you to take these 5. I ask every leader I coach to hold themselves to these, and I hold myself to them as well. Curiosity, the willingness to ask, what am I not seeing? Instead of defending what you already believe. Curiosity is what turns a threat into a question worth exploring. Clarity, knowing precisely what you stand for, stated so simply that you could say it to a room full of strangers and they'd understand exactly who they're dealing with. Vague identities can't anchor anything. Courage, the willingness to say the hard thing, ask the uncomfortable question, and sit in a room full of disagreement without needing to be the loudest voice in it. Courage is quiet more often than it's dramatic. Connection. Real leadership is relational, not positional. Nobody follows a title for very long. They follow someone who has actually seen them. Consistency, not perfection. Consistency. Being recognizably the same person in the hallway that you are in the boardroom on your best day and even the hardest one. Consistency is what makes trust compound instead of resetting every time something changes. Curiosity, clarity, courage, connection, consistency. 5 words. Say them to yourself before your next hard meeting, and I want you to notice what shifts. Before your next transformation meeting, ask a different question. Not what technology should we implement, but ask what part of who we are must still be recognizable 5 years from now. Write that answer before you build the roadmap. Technology should accelerate identity, but never replace it. Every week inside my leadership laboratory, I meet extraordinary people trying to become someone entirely new. Almost never do I encourage that. Instead, I ask, who have you always been that this next season simply needs more of? That's the question underneath everything we covered off on today. Not the self-imposed ceiling, not the treadmill, not the framework itself. Just that one question sitting quietly underneath all of it, waiting for you to actually answer it. If this episode helped you name something you've been feeling but couldn't quite put words to, that's exactly what the show is for. And it's exactly why I need your help getting it in front of more leaders who need to hear it. Hit subscribe if you haven't. Leave a comment with one idea that hit the hardest. And if you know a leader in your life who is quietly running on that treadmill right now, please send them this episode. Sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is hand them the language for what they're already been feeling. Next week, we're going deep on a question I get asked constantly in sessions. How do you build trust with a team fast when you don't have years to earn it the old way? That episode is going to challenge some assumptions, so make sure you're subscribed and you don't miss it. Lead boldly, stay curious, create more opportunity, and I'll see you next week inside the Leadership Laboratory.